I am very happy to introduce Edda Humprecht, whom I already mentioned as the lead author of the article that won our J. Blunner Best Article Award. Edda from the University of Zurich will kindly chair a panel on media and politics around the world.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. And welcome everyone to this very exciting panel on media and politics around the world. And as the title of this panel already suggests, we have papers covering different countries from all over the globe. For example, South America, Ecuador, Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. We have 3 papers, and every presenter has 12 to 15 minutes. I will give again a warning after 12 and after 15 minutes, and then we have time for discussions. And please use the chat again as you did in the previous panel, and I will read the questions out loud. And now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Lefa Afrika with the presentation titled "The Public Performance of ANC Political Demagoguery: The Case of Jacob Zuma's Arms Deal Court Appearances."
All right, I think this is it. I'm on now. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present at this conference. My name is Lefa Afrika. I've just completed a PhD at the University of Cape Town. And the presentation for today is going to be on the public performance of the African National Congress, which is the ruling party in South Africa, their political demagoguery. And this is going to be specifically on the case of Jacob Zuma, the ex-president of South Africa, and his arms deal court appearances. So what it is, what this presentation is going to cover, it's basically an exploratory study on this phenomenon, which I think is relatively like developing in South Africa as increasingly mainstream political way of communicating with constituencies. And I'm going to unpack the modalities of this performance by Jacob Zuma. And it does appear to be something very unique to South Africa, but that remains to be seen. That is why, it is an exploratory study. And it's going to be done within the context of personality cult, which is a developing sort of trend as well in political communication. And for those who are not familiar with the administration of Jacob Zuma, I'm going to also be giving a bit of context there. And in terms of theory, I'm going to frame the whole discussion within the context of the broader discussion of political demagoguery. I'm going to use narration as a methodology, because this is, in this study, understood as a story really more than anything. So like I said, there is a trend in South Africa where public performances are organized by political personalities for their own political gain, rather than maybe speaking on behalf of a political party. We've seen leaders like Ace Magashule, who's the Secretary General of the African National Congress, the ruling party, doing the same thing. Julius Malema, who once was the leader of the African National Congress's Youth League, expelled from the party and now opened his own party, uses exactly the same approach to communication. And it does seem like it is more embraced by political leaders who are embattled, who are in trouble one way or the other. Such as those who are facing court battles. And examples are in bracket. I can see that a lot of participants are non-South Africans, so I'm not gonna go into detail about who each is necessarily. It's not essential to this presentation. Those who are facing internal discipline within their own political parties, especially once again, the African National Congress, and those who are suspended or expelled by the party as well. So, and this focus on Jacob Zuma being described by Roger Southall, one of the most prominent political analysts in South Africa, as a master of political theater. I think he's the person who's championed this particular way of politically communicating with his constituencies. And he does incorporate elements of African culture, popular idiom of song and dance, and demonstrating his defiance against a particular problem that he is facing, regardless of what it is, really. And it really positioned, it locates itself within popular social memory as well for resonance. And so there is a song that Jacob Zuma usually sings when he's at these rallies called Umshini Wam. And he started singing this song way back in 2005, during one of his comrades' corruption trials, really. And since then, Jacob Zuma has positioned himself as a leader in touch with the people, who is different from the incumbent at that time. If you look at 2005, Thabo Mbeki, who was criticized for being aloof. And so these performances are actually used to convey messages of political self-defense. He would say to the people that he is the leader of the people, just wanting to economically empower Africans, especially poor Africans. And also that he was being frustrated by what he called white monopoly capital. White monopoly capital is an idea that certain white groups in South Africa are controlling the economy, while black people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of freedom are struggling economically. And so he is saying that this white monopoly capital is organizing these many attacks through the courts. So in terms of his administration, however, in as much as he's positioning himself as a champion of the plight of the people, his administration fell short. There is what is called the African National Congress's Deployment Committee, which actually places influential people in positions of influence across the government and state-owned entities. And then there is BEE policy, or triple BEE policy, which is Black Economic Empowerment in a broad-based way. So he tended to implement this policy in a manner that gave opportunities for the politically connected, especially people who are sympathetic to his cause. And I'm sure around the world, you've all heard of the Gupta family and state capture phenomenon. And and in response to that, there has been protest against Jacob Zuma's administration, a service delivery protest, and the movement called Zuma Must Fall, which was a big campaign organized in South Africa by the civil society. And of course, Bell Pottinger, a publicity campaign that was launched by them, a British-based marketing and publicity company. We all learned after the revelations that they actually helped Jacob Zuma to invent the idea of white monopoly capital. And that was aimed at sowing racial tension in South Africa so that it deflects the attention away from Jacob Zuma. And so in terms of the whole demagoguery and entertainment, basically, we have learned through literature that entertainment is increasingly adopted strategy in political communication, and that's exactly what Zuma is trying to do. And and while a lot of analysts are saying that it reignites detached citizens' interest in mainstream politics, however, I think that there are other scholars who are saying that it actually distracts citizens from politics, and at worst, it's a cause for of disengagement. And you can see from the position of this paper that it really depends on the nature of political communication concerned. It is not entertainment by its nature that is predisposed to enhancement of democracy and political engagement necessarily. If it is through demagoguery and very irresponsible means, then it does the opposite. That's the argument in this paper. And so in terms of the theory of demagoguery, I'm framing this in an understanding of demagoguery as in negative terms, in as much as other analysts would say that this is a very sort of neutral term. It neither represents negative or positive sentiment. So such that other analysts are saying that they are good and bad demagogues in the world. But in my positioning, demagogues are, in simplistic terms, bad politicians. They are politicians who deliberately lie, deceive, distort the truth, and they are very unethical generally, and they abuse their rights guaranteed in liberal constitutions around the world, because they are afforded freedom of speech, which then they abuse to spew vitriol and bile, for lack of a better expression. And so they play the popular radical sentiment, and in so doing, they become a threat to democracy in terms of Ryan Skinner's analysis. And so the understanding of demagoguery is that, it comprises of an individual politician's rhetoric. And but also it goes further than that. It encompasses the whole communication machinery that is employed by such politicians. And further than that as well, I think it also, and that is the reason why some analysts contend that, the demagogues are very, that makes the demagogues successful at what they do, is that they already latch onto demagoguery that is already spread across the society. And so the text, for those who are not familiar with our ex-president, Jacob Zuma, these are some of his pictures in action there while he's entertaining the crowds through song, dance, and speech. And so, like I mentioned, I'm going to employ the methodology of narrative analysis, which basically, in very simplistic terms, a narrative has a beginning, middle, and end, and it consists of characters, and also has, because all the narrative techniques, basically, they put audiences in position of sympathy with the main character or the hero around whom the story evolves. And so, therefore, when the plot resolves in any story, generally, it resolves itself in such a manner that it is biased towards, the ideological position of the hero. So the hero is always equated with the good, and when the hero prevails, so does the good. And so, in terms of the findings, Jacob Zuma's performances are about his personality cult. The event is always about him and not broader politics of ideology or his party. And so the supporters are therefore there for him as an individual, as we have seen with a lot of demagogues around the world. They always organize support around themselves. And it is a highly mediatized event in the sense that, and especially this particular court appearance on the 29th of May 2021. It was an appearance that is in front of TV cameras. A lot of major networks had actually covered it live, and it was also streamed, and smaller networks like EWN and IOL access the syndicated feed from SABC News on their websites as well. So, and so, social media like Twitter particularly, it was used by organizers, journalists, and supporters alike to give updates and opinionate on the event. And by the way, these findings are on a particular court appearance that happened on the 29th of May. So probably I didn't mention that in the beginning of this slide. So
we have 2 minutes left.
Oh dear. In terms of the narrative structure, in the beginning of the whole thing has been organized in terms of an event or story that has got the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so Jacob Zuma is called to appear in court. And under normal circumstances, if you and I are called to court, probably the court has the last word in terms of, that's the end of the event at that point. But by Jacob Zuma organizing his own event after the court appearance, he creates the end that actually serves him. Instead of the court having the last word, he's the guy who is the one who has the last word, through his, his helpers, a variety of helpers, including fellow politicians, prayers, as well as, his supporters, that are very radical with props that have got messages that support him. So the whole day, in as much as it was a court's day, becomes Jacob Zuma's day. And all thanks to how Jacob Zuma has organized that whole event to be about him and not to be about a court appearance, like where he is summoned and he's got no control of the situation. He turns it around and he makes it an event in which he has the last word. So in terms of the end of the narrative, he is the guy, in favor of whom the plot resolves. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And there's already a question in the chat. I think you can stop sharing your screen so we can see you while answering.
Okay,
the question, I will read the question. It's by Bernadine Jones, and she asked, when you say the event of this court appearances was mediatized, how do you understand this term? As a media event, or that the court process itself was organized toward the media logics? Fascinating research. Thanks for sharing this.
Okay. Can you please repeat the question? You were breaking a lot. I'm so sorry about that.
The question is, you talked about the court appearance, and you said it was mediatized. And the question is, how do you understand this term? Was it a media event, or was the court process itself organized towards media logics? You can also see the question in the chat.
All right. I think that it was probably both, because I think the way in which this event has been organized was in such a way that it would be an event on the ground with people, audiences attending the event, watching Jacob Zuma perform. But at the same time, it is an event that is very well aware of the fact that there will be media attention to itself, and therefore, doing that, it's a highly mediatized event, from your traditional broadcasting to the social media.
Okay, thank you. The next question is asked whether this is a problem of South America, of the ANC as a party, or of Zuma as a person. Who is to blame for the situation?
I think it is also both, because Jacob Zuma as a person was a leader with a responsibility, and he knew the ethics of leadership, probably were very well aware of that, and he should have conducted himself in a manner that is responsible, that advances democracy and engagement. But at the same time, the African National Congress allowed this to happen without reining him in, even when he was the leader of the country and of the party. And so he continues with the same performances that he used to perform when he still was president, because nothing happened to him then, and he believes nothing will happen to him now.
Okay, thank you. There's another question by Christian Vakari. He points out the similarity to the times when Silvio Berlusconi was party leader and prime minister in Italy. I actually also thought that. And Christian asked, did Zuma encounter significant resistance from journalists and news organizations as he tried to hijack the court proceedings and subvert the separation of powers?
Yes, he did. He encountered a lot of criticism, and in fact, he himself thought of journalists as people who hated him. And he, in one of his court appearances, in fact, in this particular court appearance, one of the reasons for wanting to have the state prosecutor recused himself from the case is because he says the prosecutor colludes with the media, he leaks the stories in the media, and therefore driving hatred on Jacob Zuma by the media. So the media is very critical of Jacob Zuma, and they expect a lot out of him as a leader who is supposed to be responsible, who's leading the party of Nelson Mandela, but he has other ideas.
Okay, there's another question that goes in a similar direction, and you elaborated on this topic where maybe you can share your thought. The question is, could the coverage have been different given that Zuma is a performer? He made his court appearance newsworthy. Is there any way the news media could have reacted in a different way? What do you think?
I think that it's a good strategy to give him credit as a strategist on that front, because I think the media cannot resist him. He is, they having a very sort of ambivalent relationship in that sense that, no media in South Africa can resist any event that is attended by Jacob Zuma. Like I said, I mean, it's very expensive, and it has got to be a very special occasion for major news media organizations in South Africa to cover any event live. And almost without fail, all the court appearances of Jacob Zuma that I can recall have been recorded live. So in as much as they hate him, they also love him just the same. And he appears to know that and sometimes he criticizes them on their own network, so to say. But it's a relationship. It doesn't seem like they can resist him by boycotting him or not covering his events as much as they do. So and that works for Jacob Zuma.
Here's another question asking, how do we reconcile with the fact that the media borrows from decolonial term whereby Zuma, as a minority, Black from Global South, is given space to articulate resistance to global structural imperialism from alternative and community media?
So if I understand your question well, is that Jacob Zuma is actually on the left side, and he is seemingly championing the sentiment of ordinary South Africans by then resisting imperialist forces. Is that how I understand your question? Am I interpreting it correctly?
The question is by Oswald in the chat, but I think you got it correctly.
Okay.
If not, you can continue the conversation in the chat.
I hear you. It is an interesting one because Jacob Zuma does actually position himself as a champion of the voiceless, the disenfranchised, and so on. But I think where the problem is his actions. And in fact, even when he was president, in my view, he was acting like an activist who does not have control of government, because he was always blaming somebody else instead of implementing the very policies that are in line with what he was preaching. So, and instead of doing that, there have been stories like state capture, corruption on a grand scale, and so on. And therefore, because of that, he has not been true to his word. And things that he has done in South Africa, that are seemingly to champion the cause of the masses, for example, like introducing free higher education in South Africa, or trying to. And a lot of analysts are seeing those kind of moves as a way of protecting his own skin and acting on principle, because he was already politically embattled. So those moves were going to help him to win the sympathy of the broader South African society.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. If there are further questions, you continue to discuss in the chat. And in the interest of time, we will move on to the next presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you
Lefa.
so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
You can unshare your screen now, so the next presenter can share his screen. And the next presentation is by Palos Pons from the University of California, San Diego. And the presentation is titled Populism Influence on Media Content, Polarization and Professionalism in Ecuador Before and During Correa's Era.
Hi, hello. Good morning from San Diego, 6 in the morning here. Hello. So I'm going to try to share my screen. By the way, this case, Jacob Zuma, reminds me a lot to Rafael Correa, by the way, I have to say. Okay, so. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go directly, to the thesis here. So basically, my study is about the relationship between populism and news media content. Okay, I was trying to focus on news media content, but in any case, this the study is about the relationship in general between populism and journalism. Okay, but I was trying to focus on that aspect because I think it's unexplored when we're dealing about populism in power. Okay, but at this point, I will say just about theory because the way theory has been dealing with this issue to this point thus far has been in these three. I was trying to situate at least the way theory is dealing with populism, the relationship between populism and journalism in these three ways. Okay, we have media populism in Europe. We have a lot of studies that basically analyze the way populism is reflected in media. Okay, then we have what I will call the silencing thesis. Okay, where basically populism is at odds with journalism, at odds with news media. The news media is basically the enemy of the people. So it's basically supposed or presupposed that this is going to be an antagonistic relationship between populism and news media. Okay, so basically when populism is in power, there's going to be some kind of repressing situation with news media. Critical news media will be silenced and so on and so forth. This will be a very, very well represented theoretical approach towards this relationship. The next one is the polarization thesis. Okay, basically here, and we have some content analysis here. We don't have content analysis in this thesis, so I was trying to respond also to this thesis. If we can see through content analysis that when the populace is in power, we can see the way news media is silenced, but we don't have content analysis here. We do have some content analysis here in Europe and Latin America. Basically, this thesis is saying that when you have populism in power or when populism is around, it doesn't have to be necessary in power, some kind of polarization, polarization thrives, okay? Manichaeism also will be around, polarization will increase when populism is in power or when you have influencing populist actors, okay? And this last thesis or this last hypothesis, I would say, or this last research question / hypothesis is not around. This is not part of any theoretical approach up to this point. This is basically, it was raised after I was studying the Ecuadorian case with my advisor, Dan Halling. So I was in Ecuador for a number of months. I was there making a lot of interviews, having some observers, participant observation and things like that. And actually, we published an article based on this study when we were there, and in Ecuador doing all this qualitative work. And we found this very interesting claim or this very interesting finding, we can say that, that for most of journalists and for most of media actors that we interview in Ecuador, a journalism or journalistic professionalism had improved when Correa was in power. So basically, here we have this hypotheses here and one research question. Okay, maybe when I'm trying to publish this, maybe I will cut down, the research question, but whatever. I'm going to focus on this. Hypothesis 1, oppositional media was suppressed once Correa consolidated power. Okay. Hypothesis 2, polarization increased during Correa's presidency. Okay. Hypothesis 3, populism under Correa led to an increase in journalistic professionalism. And then I added also a research question that is related to this media populism scholarship from Europe. How were populist ideas expressed in news content before, during, and after Correa's regime? Okay, I think what is interesting here in this case is that I'm dealing here, with a populist in power. Okay, a very pervasive / powerful populist in power, and we have this. Well, some people have qualified the Ecuadorian political system as a political roller coaster. Okay, so we have very different political contexts and legal and political contexts. Okay, before Correa, during Correa, and after Correa. And my idea was to observe, if there was some influence from this very clearly differentiated political and legal context on news content. Okay, that was basically the main idea. So I was trying to see how to narrow down this very idea. And then when I was doing my research, I was encountering all these theoretical approaches and so on. So those are basically my hypothesis and my research question. Okay, the results here. Oh, method, very important, sorry, method. I was using the two most read newspapers in the country, El Comercio from Quito and Universo from Guayaquil. Okay, these are very important newspapers in Ecuador, elite newspapers in their context. Okay, and I was doing a longitudinal content analysis from years 2005, 2006, 2015, 2016, and 2018. 2005 and 2006, before Correa, those were very interesting years where you have also these are the years, I call these years the populist biennium in Ecuador. Okay, these years are very interesting to see how Correa emerged as an outsider populist leader. Okay, and in 2015, 2016, you have the communication law, which was a very important law in Ecuador, one of the boldest communication laws in the region in Latin America. In the law, content was regulated, for instance. The ontological norms were part of the law for journalistics, for professionalism, and so on. So in 2015, 2016, the law was totally implemented in the country. And 2018, Correa was out of power, and Moreno, former Correa's vice president, was totally at odds with Correa, basically opposed Correa from day one, and basically was trying to reverse all this legislation, all these policies that Correa was enacting when he was in power. Okay, there were 960 articles. I had 2 units of analysis, sources and articles, and I was focusing on 9 variables. These are variables: tone towards political actors, including the government, differential, adversarial, neutral; source, I was studying source; ideology, left, right, and transversal; political parallelism, exploratory political parallelism, because in Ecuador there was not a clear, party system. It's still, the country, there's not a clear party system at this stage in Ecuador, I would say. So it's an exploratory political parallelism variable, where I was trying to see where are rejections and where are supports to institutions and political parties here. Okay, target: elitist, civic and plural, popular and partisan, based on sources. Okay, this variable is built on sources. Subject: genre. Okay, what are the kind of the genre of the news release, in-depth stories, or what we call in Spanish reportaje, interviews, chronicles, opinion article. The difference between opinion and the news is analyzed here in this variable. And then I also coded a couple of variables to see how populist ideas were expressed in the news here: the people and the antagonist or the enemy. Okay, results. Hypothesis 1, the silencing hypothesis. Okay, it's not confirmed. You know, from content analysis, I cannot confirm that media was silenced by Rafael Correa. We're talking here about private media that were, we can see that through news contents that this media was highly critical against Correa, actually. So I don't know, I don't see a silencing process here. I don't see. Maybe you can see that through the tone variable, where actually when Correa was in power, differential reporting was really low, Neutral reporting was high, highest point, and adversarial reporting was very high, pretty high, almost the same as before. Actually, the difference between pre-Correa and Correa was not significant. And between Correa and post-Correa was significant. Okay, and if you look at the sources, and you have a lot of information here in the source variable, of course, you know, you can maybe guess that something problematic was happening in terms of the use of government sources and the oficialismo, meaning the left-wing parties that supported the government, the oficialismo sources. Okay, you know, sorry, I need to drink a little bit. Meaning that maybe the government and oficialismo, when
you
Correa
have
was
3
in
minutes
power,
left.
I'm sorry, was overrepresented. Okay, you can say that. Or maybe because of the communication law, that would be another guess of why this happened, is maybe because of the communication law basically push newspapers and journalists to cite everybody in the story, you know, they needed to cite oficialistas more, they needed to cite government more, but whatever. But this can be an open discussion after when the questions and so on, but I don't see a silencing process here going on. Polarization, this is very clear, I think. Yeah, polarization increased when Correa was in power. And this is very interesting because polarization was not focused on ideology, but it was focused mostly on the political figure. You know, Correa himself was the polarizing drive or something like that. Journalistic professionalism, improvements confirmed. If you take a look to the target of journals, of newspapers, they were more open, you know? And if you take a look to subjects, there were more subjects and more diverse than before Correa. And if you take a look at genres, for instance, they were using more complex genres as reportajes, in-depth stories. And the difference between opinion and news was more sharp. It was sharper, you know, the difference between the opinion and news. And I'm going to finish here with media populism. Before Correa, this is a very clear case of populism through the media. Okay, left-wing type, if you see the difference between what is the people and what is the enemy. Okay, but when Correa is in power, the picture is very weird and problematic. Okay, some people, Philip Pisberger from Argentina, call about anti-populist populism or anti-populist populism bloc, you know, anti-populist against populism, but it's complicated, it's confusing. Okay, so I will go to discussion right now, right to the point. So my argument is that with Correa in power, we have a new polarized and even more plural populist system emerging here. And before Correa, what we have in Ecuador was more similar to what some authors call a liberal capture media system. Okay, with Correa in power, media became more critical against the government than before. Okay, and the question of self-censorship and government control must be put in context. Maybe it's problematic. It's difficult to see that. We need to have a discussion about this. And the relationship between populism and journalism is not defined by a simple opposite logics. And this is a left-wing populist case. Of course, what happens when a right-wing populist is in power, for instance, like Bolsonaro, Orban, Trump, and I will stop here. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I think you can unshare your screen so we can see everyone. And I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but while everyone is typing their question, I will start with a question. So you were talking about the concept of populism, and populism has been described in the literature as a thin ideology, or also as a communication style. And if I understood you correctly, you in your study you see it more like an authoritarian government style or something in this direction. Can you elaborate a bit on your understanding of populism in this context?
Basically, the definition I was taking to start this study is very, is the very basical, I think, ideational definition by Kasmude, basically, a thin ideology, as you were saying. Because it's a thin ideology, you can label, or you can use populism in a left-wing way, in a right-wing way. So basically here it's very clear, because the enemy is the oligarchy. Before Correa was in power, it was the political parties, the political system. If you take the case, for instance, of Trump here in the United States, the enemy is the immigrants, or the alliance between liberal professionals from Washington and New York and the immigrants. This kind of conspiracy theories is, I think, what defines populism is the way they use, the way they label, or the way they make this, frontier between what is the people and what is the enemy. And here in this case, in the Ecuadorian case, is very clear. The people is is a more inclusive definition of the people, the Ecuadorian people, and the enemy is, it used to be the political class before Correa came to power, and when Correa was in power, it was also la prensa corrupta, the corrupt press, was part of the problem. Yes, authoritarian tics. There were authoritarian tics, of course. Everything was pretty vertical when Correa was in power, pretty vertical. Yeah, like everything was personalized, like the Jacob Zuma case, probably. There were, I was thinking about similarities between these two cases. Yes, there's
certainly many similarities. There are some questions now on the chat. There's a question by Christian Beccari, who said, do you have a sense that your findings may differ if you analyze different types of media than the ones you coded, or would you expect them to remain similar?
I'm calling here, I'm talking here from intuition. But if I have to say something, I would say they will be similar among or between television broadcasting and these new newspapers. Okay, because these newspapers are the ones that basically set they set the agenda, I would say, even today. And after you have the television basically reporting what these newspapers are publishing. So, and Ecuador is basically a country that is divided into two main regions: Quito, where it's the political capital, and Guayaquil, where it's the economic capital. So basically, these two newspapers are these, classical elite newspapers that basically are setting the agenda, and then you have the television broadcasters basically following, the trend. But that's an intuition. I don't know. You will need to do some coding from television, from private television, Ecuavisa. I know the television in Ecuador, yes, but I think they will be similar.
So maybe ideas for future research. There's another question now in the chat asking, how would you define media in Ecuador in terms of freedom and diversity? In general?
Problematic. Media in Ecuador are problematic. The point here is that when I was doing my fieldwork in Ecuador, and all this is published, by the way, in the international, in the Journal of International Communication Journal. You have to put these things in perspective when you're talking about Ecuador. I would say that you cannot say that before Correa everything was pink and everybody was free and all media were independent and they were just doing their job and that's it. Press freedom was a problematic issue before Correa came to power, when Correa was in power, and it's still an issue right now in Ecuador. I would say just press freedom. just to focus the discussion on the press freedom issue. If you're talking about diversity, I will say that following these results from news content, diversity through these two newspapers increased when Correa was in power. Diversity increased, and diversity decreased when Correa was out of power. And Moreno, the vice president, the new president that say bye-bye to Correa's policies, was in power, diversity declined, I will say. Okay, so diversity, yes, but you have to put these things in perspective. You cannot understand Ecuadorian media in the same way you understand American media, European media, or things like that. Yeah.
Another question that came to my mind when listening to your presentation, but maybe you can elaborate a little on your measure and understanding of polarization, because this is a concept which is of interest to many researchers also, and especially again the background that you might also expect when something like Correa is in power, more watchdog journalism, or you talked about journalism professionalism. How do you find because I think the lines are very thin between, you know, controversial coverage and also critical coverage in the sense of professionalism. Maybe you can elaborate a little on this.
Well, that's difficult to find that through media content, I will say. That's difficult. You know, you can combine probably more qualitative research with quantitative research. It's very difficult to assess, you know, the level of watchdog journalism through news media content. But I would say media were more critical, and through my own work coding, through my own work being there in the field, I will say that media were, you know, doing their job in their way before Correa came to power. And it was pretty similar, you know, when Correa was in power towards the government. Basically, what they were saying, you know, the people there in the field, journalists, any journalist, you know, more closer to Correa or totally critical towards Correa, they were saying that, you know, transparency was an issue before Correa, during Correa, and now, always an issue. You know, so to perform as a watchdog journalist in Ecuador was a problem before with Correa and after Correa. So maybe there were other issues, you know, like more sources were used. Oh, by the way, it wasn't my presentation. Sources increased 22%, you know, when Correa was in power. This, you know, the level stays the same right now, but I don't know, but it's difficult to see that through content analysis, but I think it's basically the same. It was not transformed. Yeah.
There are now two questions in the chat. Maybe we only have time for one, and you can answer the other one in the chat afterwards. So I will pick the last one. It reads, how criticism on Helen Mancini's model you applied in your study is considered in your research? Can you elaborate?
Halin is my advisor, so I will say, yeah. Well, by the way, one criticism is this definition of Latin American media systems as similar to pluralist media systems from Mediterranean countries in Europe. By the way, I'm from Spain. When populism is in power in Ecuador and probably in other Latin American countries, yes, I can see some similarities between pluralist media systems in Europe and in Latin America, but not before. Before, I don't see similarities. And in the level of professionalism is different. So I would say that attempt to find a similarity between Mediterranean media systems from Europe and Latin American media systems from Europe, and that was, I think, in the introduction of the book and so on. Yeah, I didn't buy that. You know, I didn't buy that from the very beginning, and I saw this. And maybe with Korean power, yes, you have a cleavage, you have a parties, you know, a more structured political system, and then you can have some political parallelism and so on and so forth. But before, there's no political parallelism in media because the party system is very confusing, I would say.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Again, you could answer the other questions in the chat, and we will move on to our third presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And the third presentation is by Svetlana Bodrunova and from the University of St. Petersburg, and co-authors, and it is titled Risks of COVID-19 Reporting in Semi-Authoritarian States, Perceived Pressures on Journalists in Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan.
Yes, hi everyone, and thanks for this introduction, Edda. And I'm trying now to share my screen. Hope it's all seen well. And I'll try to keep to the timing, though it's not very easy. Yes, we are a team of reporters who, team of researchers who belong now to the project initiated by Ingrid Volkmar in Australia, and now it unites 70 researchers from 34 countries, which is called Global Risk Journalism Hub. And what I'm presenting now is sort of a preliminary snapshot survey result. However, it already provides for the thinking, and I would like our results to be sort of seen to our fellow scholars. Maybe you find some of them interesting at least. The overall framework of the project and of today's literature and today's understanding of risk in journalism actually is fractured into several approaches, and they today are more and more intertwined. First of all, we speak of risk journalism based on the necessity of risk communication in the risk society, and this has a critique of professional challenges and shortcomings in reporting risks. It's quite a long story of the risk journalism assessment. However, at some point it comes to journalism at risk. And this unites sort of critical events when one cannot perform professional duties, and also critical distortions, both coming from journalists and coming from the outer societies, so to say, which also prevent journalists from performing their professional duties. While reporting on risk, it usually becomes risky for the journalism itself. And it speaks about, this part of literature speaks about safety of journalists and pressures upon journalists and editorial offices. However, despite it seems to be an enormous area of research, it happened so that the journalists' perceptions of risk, especially transnational research, only appeared 15 to 18 years ago, and now it's mounting growing evidence. However, in terms of methodologies and cross-country comparisons, it's still an emergent area of research. If you see my screen, which is spoiled now, I'm sorry for that. And
yeah,
maybe
someone is painting on the screen, yeah. Please.
But I'll continue. I think it's what I can say so far is sort of more important than what is written. And transnationality of risks is also taken into consideration. It has firmly become a daily agenda of journalists and a research agenda, and globality demands a more nuanced view of risk reporting, as Ingrid always insists. Journalist views started to matter in research, and at this point, the COVID-19 happened, and it created sort of a new general risk frame, we would say, because all the risks intertwined in one. However, we would say that the current division accepted by the UN division of risks for journalism, for example, the life health assaults that are seen as a UN sustainability indicator, are less linked to the COVID-19. These risks are something like kidnapping or killing at war. Of course, these are substituted by the health risk by disease. However, there are also risks that are felt by the journalists but do not happen yet to them. And this is always a pressure of what might happen. And these risks have also been insisted on taking into consideration by several researchers. The post-Soviet space in this respect as a region, as an area, is quite diverse and remains under-researched, especially some countries in this area and sub-regions like Central Asia. The internal diversity of this region, which for 30 years has been developing into different directions, so to say, of course, creates also attention in comparison. And this uneven interest from abroad, from the outside of this region, also creates this, shortcomings in terms of how to compare, because there's no previous data sometimes. Another complication is complication of access to data and respondents, and we have suffered from it as well. So when we speak about pressures, actually, we see a double pressure to journalists due to the COVID and also due to the political status of the countries, because they are considered at least semi-autocracies, and some of them are considered full autocracies for a lot of international, mostly Western, but anyway, research. The post-Soviet background and the countries that we have selected for our study actually do have similarities that allow for comparative research on the journalistic community and on the current journalistic risks. First of all the countries, of course, are considered non-democracies, or at least the countries with no long democratic tradition, despite some trends that you can trace, for example, in Kazakhstan. In these countries, in all of these countries, you see quite deep divisions, much deeper than in today's US. You can trust me, but now today in the US, you can sort of feel how it feels, what we've been living through for the last 30 years or so, because this values-based fragmentation creates clusters of society who do not speak to each other, who live in parallel lives, so to say. For creating them a shared informational space demanded from the states to have a major share of the market to be subjected to the state. And this state-owned television, state-owned newspapers promote pro-establishment discourses, and liberal media are marginalized in terms of audiences, access, and different types of privileges. However, the audiences try to find a more free space for discussion, and they shift to social media, not only to in search of more adaptation to their own needs of media consumption, but also to political reasons for finding a freer space for discussion. In response, in 7 to 5 years, a wave of restrictive regulation on communication, internet, media, and political life have been introduced in practically all the 5 countries, most of them aiming not, for example, to censorship, but at self-censorship, at creating an atmosphere of self-censoring, because this atmosphere is the atmosphere of uncertainty, as Palos would insist. The differences are also there. For example, the journalistic communities, quite unexpectedly, for Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, consider themselves quite an actor of public space in terms of their united bargaining power in the public sphere. And when something happens to a journalist, people actually unite. And there are also organizations who are barred from Russia, such as Internews or Soros Foundation or other foundations who promote journalistic professional standards, unlike in Russia and today's Belarus. So our research questions would be quite natural within the overall framework of global risk journalism project. What types of risks cause major concern for journalists of this area, and how does it relate to their professional and personal traits? For me personally, the third question was the most interesting. Is there a difference between the 2 post-Soviet sub-regions, Central Asia and sort of, the Slavic area, Russia and Belarus, to which I myself both belong because I was born in Belarus but live in Russia? So our questionnaire was general for the whole project. It included, we amended it a tiny bit for Russia, Belarus and Central Asia. We had a couple of more additional variables that we considered important. However, it was 42 questions in 8 domains, 2 for metadata, as I said, and 6 for different types of risks. For this research, we had 240 respondents, and it just happened so that it was 120 and 120 for the 2 sub-regions. And these 2 parts of our sample were comparable in gender, age, and profession, as checked by by comparing means. However, we also had huge limitations on data collection, and this is why our samples are not perfect. Because people did not respond to us. Practically nothing worked except for our personal connections and snowballing. And this was much more complicated than 3 to 4 years ago when we were doing another research on self-censorship in Russia. That was much easier at that moment. And I think this is an implication of what we have seen as a new wave of laws. People did not respond to social media, did not respond to editorial, when we addressed editorial offices, when we addressed influencers, when we addressed organizations. Nothing worked except for our own relations with journalists and the snowballing effect when they saw that it was quite safe to answer the questions. As to the results, and sorry, the screen is still reddish at some in some bits of it. The only, like speaking ahead, the only significant difference between Central Asia and Russia and Belarus on the other side was that more people perceived risk as important and perceived that they were exposed to risk. I highlighted Belarus here because Belarus was quite COVID denialist as a state for quite a long time. And also the second phase of the pandemic coincided with a major wave of protest, as you probably all know. And journalism's attention was diverted to this protest. And this is why the pandemic was sort of less relevant, I think. So almost half of the journalists didn't say that they were feeling constantly exposed to risks, constantly exposed to COVID-19. The country was perceiving this sort of calmer than other countries. However, in the Central Asian countries, the risks were considered quite high. The employers who had to provide protective means, this is our first domain of concern, so to say here, did not, almost 50% of journalists didn't agree that they were provided, didn't report that they were provided such PPE means, as we call them. However, they were more or less satisfied, especially in Belarus and Tajikistan, about how the personal equipment was safe, so to say, logistics was safe enough. And nearly 50% of people said that people could work remotely. In order to put this in more context, we will have more comparisons with other countries and regions, but so far we didn't see a lot of tension about it. As to the second domain, which did cause a bit of tension both in our interviews and in the survey, we have seen that in 4 countries, nearly 100% of journalists said that they were very well guided by the editorial offices in terms of disinformation. However, as you see, it didn't provide for a lot of understanding. Fake news was considered quite a pressure in terms of not only affecting news gathering, but also public perception of media and media trust. In 2 countries, at least, Belarus and Tajikistan, there was also another issue about fake news. The COVID denialist countries and the authorities in them actually warned journalists about publishing right information and considered this as fake. So the situation with fakes, especially in COVID denialist countries, is a bit more complicated than just fighting untruthful information and misinformation and disinformation in both of its forms.
You have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, as to the sources, we have seen that in the Central Asian countries, due to lack of access to authorities and due to lack of access to information, alternative sources were more used. And as to the political pressures, we have seen that this was a major area after the immediate health risk that, of course, caused attention. And we have seen that our anonymous questionnaire showed us that when you ask whether authorities have insisted on your publishing or non-publishing information, because we had 2 questions like this, as you see, journalists in Central Asia, those who said yes and those who said I don't want to answer, being afraid probably, amount to over 50%. In Russia, a bit less, but still over 1/3, which I think is a finding in itself. And as we had 2 questions, so it more or less sort of cross-validates these findings, and there was no difference either in silencing or pushing some information through the journalists. Speaking about economic and cultural pressures, they were less significant. And as I said before, we didn't find a lot of difference. We compared it by different statistical means, including comparing means, student T criterion, and so on. However, even if the situation was similar in responses of journalists, this might be related to very different factors inside our samples. And here, without posting exact correlations, just for time, or for the sake of time, I am posting what actually mattered, which factors mattered for different domains of risk. And interestingly, disinformation for Central Asia depended on a lot of things, while in Russia it practically didn't depend on anything. Health threats were dependent on different, on editorial status, like whether you work as an editor or journalist. This also mattered for health protection in Russia. But as to the use of mainstream sources, in Russia it was all quite complicated. While in Central Asia, it was not only the status mattered, only if you're an editor, you get better to the sources. What we expected is that the size of the city where a journal or a town where a journalist resides would matter a lot. No, it mattered only in terms of access to sources. And the reach, whether you're writing international news, national news, or local news, matters much more in this respect, wherever you live. It matters for whether you look at, and especially it matters for Russia rather than for Central Asia, Russia and Belarus, because there you depend on cultural pressures are linked to this. Use of alternative sources are linked to whether you write internationally or locally, and use of mainstream sources also depend on this. But anyway, the status of your editorial position, your editorial status matters most of all, for all the differences that we could find. The last thing that I wanted to show, I'm sorry for the quality of this picture, is that we need to look at constellations of different variables to see the divergent groups in how journalists treat their risks, because one variable is not enough. Simple correlations are not enough. For example, we have seen that if you look for status and reach of your topics, you will find that political pressures are very different for different groups, two different groups of journalists. So the take-homes are the following. The post-Soviet space exposes very similar perceptions of COVID-related threats by journalists, and this might be due to the political status of these countries or to some universality of patterns of COVID-19 and its health risks. Political pressures are seen as second to the immediate health risks, and they have been experienced for around 50% of journalists in Central Asia. The differences might lie in editorial status of a journalist, and this needs to be explored more. And also we insist that groups of journalists are quite latent in terms of how they perceive risks, and we need more research and more constellations of variables to detect these latent groups of different risk perceptors. Thank you so much, and sorry I've been long.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Very interesting study. I don't see a question in the chat right now, so I will start again. I found it very interesting that you pointed out that in the Central Asian countries, the threat regarding disinformation was quite different from the other countries. And you said that those journalists, they were told that they're not allowed to report on facts, probably against the mainstream information or opinion that was distributed by the government. Can you elaborate a little how this worked and what exactly the journalists told you about the situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not only journalists, but also researchers who did one study a bit before ours, and this was of real help. Galiya Ibrayeva participated in another study, international study with several co-authors. Also, interestingly, to sort of prevent panic, it seems, to prevent moral panic, the authorities chose this denialist strategies, and they dismissed information on COVID as information of private domain. So they said, if you publish something that belongs to personal health, you will be immediately subjected to law. So this is how it worked. So it was all framed as like personal health issues of people under scrutiny, under medical scrutiny, but not public health issue, so to say. So this was quite, and journalists actually voluntarily and consciously struggled with this position. And in the end, they could publish information from different research agencies, WHO, and all the rest. But it took several months, at least, to fight for this right to publish an absolutely right information which had no fake whatsoever.
You also touch upon the topic of trust, and that it was perceived as also a threat by the journalists, the loss in trust. In many Western countries, we had seen during the pandemic an increase in trust in news media in the beginning of the pandemic, and then a decrease afterwards. How was it in the countries you studied?
I have written a small chapter, a tiny chapter in a book about COVID and political communication. My chapter was on Russia, naturally. What I stated there was that there was a glass wall sort of between the authorities, the media, and the people, sort of authorities and media on one side and the people, because authorities, for the first time ever, they tried to be on the right side, so to say, you know, and after being so long on the side of the besieged castle, so to say, after that, they somehow shifted to be on the good side. But how could you expect that people would believe it? Like, you know, and people became sort of a weathercock behavior they showed. And there was latent disobedience, which was very much reminiscent of the Soviet times. And media, despite sort of trying to convey good information, they could not breach this huge loss of trust that existed before. Because if you go for Edelman measurements or whatever agency that measures trust internationally, you will see that Russia goes much deeper, like number 30 of 30 measured countries in between authorities, media, and people. And this converted easily into very low vaccination levels, into 25% of people who did not believe that the pandemic was there at all. And I think that media couldn't do a lot in this respect, because this linkage between the authorities and federal channels, for example, created this mediocratic space that could not be diverted to openness, and even when it was necessary, could not be transformed into an open space so easily that people could trust it quite well. So the problem was even bigger, I think, than in democracies, because people rushed to media for a moment, and media on the other side were also abusing the situation, because they were giving a lot of information quite out of context. Quite out of, like, you know, giving a lot of information doesn't mean giving meaningful information. So there were two big problems: this information pouring, even not fakes, just even normal information. Information pouring with no contextualization, and this glass wall of trust that could not be breached, even today, could not be overcome.
There is another question in the chat. And it says, I was interviewing Russian journalists on a similar topic this summer. It's by Sasha Popina and the summer, and they also talked about the risk and pressure connected to reporting the officials and unofficial stats, for example, death rates. Is it something that you saw in your results?
Unfortunately, as our frame was like for the whole world, you know, very international, we couldn't capture these peculiarities, but this definitely come out of the interviews and from our own living. The case of unofficial statistics was huge, especially for St. Petersburg, where I live, and also for the countries under scrutiny in our presentation today. So unofficial statistics, because even if it was the best available statistics, because even gathering the statistics could be complicated for the medical entities without, you know, the necessity of distortion, without necessarily distorting it on purpose. However, even if this was the best available statistics, it was never trusted again, you know. Also in St. Petersburg, there was sort of a month or so when the statistics was completely artificial, and this was proven by an independent researcher, Alexei Kupriyanov, who works in St. Petersburg and has an independent statistical website dedicated completely to COVID. So there were cases that were discussed in media, they were discussed by journalists, and of course they created sort of a lack of fundamental layer of information to which you go, because WHO data were too general for us. Unfortunately, we still live in these conditions, and we try to watch every day whether the statistics resemble something right, so to say. This is the situation, unfortunately, that diverts people as well from believing into news, and at the end, just the apathy of, you know, looking at it all the time, and because you ultimately do not know, and you cannot get away from this feeling. Even journalists cannot.
Thank you, Svetlana, and thank you to all the presenters for this very diverse, interesting panel. Our time is over, and I give back to Christian Bakary at this point. Thanks again.